Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the launch of the Military Balance 2015. My name is Bastian Gigerich. I'm the Director for Defense and Military Analysis at the IISS, and I have here on the podium with me, I'll be chairing the event, I'll have here on the podium with me four members of the team who have put the book together. On my far left, James Hackett, who is the editor of the Military Balance and a senior fellow in the Defense and Military Analysis program. On my immediate left we have Douglas Barry, who is our senior military aerospace fellow, and on my immediate right we have Brigadier Ben Barry, who is our senior expert on land warfare, and on my far right we have Giri Rajendran, who is our defense economist. We will do this in the following way. We will give brief introductory remarks covering some of the headline findings and bits of analysis in the book, and then we will want to open it up for discussion. Welcome to the IISS-US. You know, we are an international think tank with our headquarters in London, offices in Singapore and Bahrain, and obviously here in the US, also a presence in India. We work on matters of political and military conflict, geoeconomics, and defense. I think it's important to point out that we very much consider ourselves to be an international institute, even though our headquarters is in London. We're international. We have an international outlook. We have international staff, and certainly wouldn't think of ourselves as a British organization. We are independent. We are a think tank that funds itself through a variety of projects and membership arrangements. And what we try to do is, in our work, address audiences in government, academia, and increasingly also the private sector. All of us here on the panel, on the podium, are based in London, in the London office. We have obviously looked quite a bit at European security and defense issues. It's obviously a very challenging time for European security matters at the moment. We're looking very closely at the responses that we can see throughout Europe on the changing security environment in the East and the South. We're looking at the defense economic picture in Europe and worldwide, and I'm sure that's a theme that will guide us in our conversation today. My colleagues and I here on the podium represent the Defense and Military Analysis program, and the reason for getting you all here today, and thank you very much for being here, is the publication of our flagship product, which is the Military Balance. There's a display copy in the back of the room. There's also a little handout that I hope you got a copy of when you walked in, which has some of the that we will be talking about. As I said, I'll ask my colleagues to speak for about 5 to 6 minutes each, starting with James, who will cover some headline findings from the book, then turning to Giri, who will do the defense economics picture, then turning to Ben, who will cover some trends in land warfare and speak on Ukraine and the fight against ISIS. And then, last but not least, we'll be turning to Douglas, who will spend a bit of time on directed energy and also cover aspects of Russian military modernization. And we are, of course, open to then discussing these themes and others with you. So I will stop now and turn the floor over to James. James, please.
Thanks, Bastian. For those of you not familiar with the Military Balance, we can take a bit of time afterwards maybe to go through some of the content. We'll talk a lot about policy issues today, but the Military Balance, since its foundation in 1959, first of all, was seen as a quantitative aid to defining better the military capabilities of the East and West. And it's funny, but in a way the debate shifted back to that now. In the years since its foundation, of course, the Institute and the military balance as a product have looked more at qualitative issues. And the military balance now at 504 pages versus the 11 when it first started. There's an awful lot more breadth of data and analysis that allows policymakers and the interested defence community to determine key capabilities in states around the world. We do 170 states, but also define trends over time. So what I'll do is talk a few minutes about the themes of this book, touching on some regional issues. And the book, as in the last few years, opens up with some thematic and technical defence essays. This year we've got one on directed energy systems, which, as Bastian said, Doug will touch on later. Military space systems is the next. And then the third piece focuses on the challenges posed by hybrid warfare. Now, attention on this latter point has, of course, been stimulated by Ukraine. And the question there of Russia's military role is central, with Moscow still denying overt intervention in eastern Ukraine, even though some military equipment seen there has previously only been seen in Russian service. The war of perception, the information domain, is perhaps as keenly contested as the physical battle space. In Crimea, Russia employed both traditional and non-traditional instruments to achieve its goals. Many of these techniques are well established, but their synchronized and rapid application was novel. Though much investment in Russia's military reform process has focused on rapid reaction capabilities, such as those seen in Crimea, Russia's armed forces more broadly have undergone substantial change, most notably since the 2008 defence reform process began. Military reorganisation continues, key army equipment is still modernising, and Russia continues to invest in new ships, combat aircraft and guided weapons. And Russia watchers, I think, are anticipating the forthcoming May Day parade for the full unveiling of Russia's new armoured platforms. For NATO's member states, many still with deployed forces and aspirations to act globally, the conflict in Ukraine has sharpened the long-running debate over the decline in Western military spending and the effect of this on capability. Though the capability of military equipment itself has improved over the last 20 years, numbers have substantially reduced. Our data indicates that between 1995 and 2015, main battle tank numbers in Europe dropped from about 25,000 to just under 8,000, while fighters and ground attack aircraft decreased from about 5,400 to about 2,400. But though Russia's actions have alarmed many states in Europe, this concern has yet, apart from in a few cases, to be translated into increased defence acquisitions. For most European states, defence remains discretionary, and even in cases where defence and military issues form part of the current political discourse, the drivers for concerns are at times local, not regional. Witness southern European states' preoccupation with the Mediterranean. The reassurance initiatives undertaken by NATO and the US have again highlighted the continuing central place of the US in European security and military dynamics. Just a few years back, in the context of the announced rebalance of the Asia-Pacific, questions were raised about the future shape of the US defence commitment in Europe. But though the US has substantially reduced its presence on the continent, its military commitment remains significant, and activities under the European Reassurance Initiative have been important for NATO and its eastern states. Indeed, our figures indicate that at the early 2015, the US Air Force in Europe was the continent's 8th biggest air force, while the total number of personnel, US personnel in Europe, meant that the US came 10th when the continent's military strength was ranked by active personnel. In contrast to the situation in Europe, overall defence spending increased again in Asia. China's defence spending continues to outpace its neighbours' efforts, and China's military procurement program continues to attract attention, such as its carrier, destroyer and combat aircraft programs. Its armed forces are continuing to develop their training and deployment regimes, even if there remains some doubt over certain points like the level of command delegation and personnel initiative. China recently engaged in another non-combatant evacuation operation, this time from Yemen, while continued maritime deployments off Somalia, where piracy has been almost eliminated, indicates that the counter-piracy patrols are no longer solely about maritime security. Rather, as indicated by a host of port visits and diplomatic events, they represent useful extra-regional forays to build relationships, experience, and presence. Turning to the Middle East, Ben will talk more about Syria, Iraq and ISIS, but further south, recent military activity by Gulf states, which has taken place episodically since 2011, illustrates a readiness to use force to fulfill national security priorities, exemplified by operations against ISIS, over Libya in 2014, as well as over Yemen. These regional states continue to procure a wide range of advanced capability military systems. But while military activity still tends to be nested within broader US-led coalitions, or the US might remain involved with our capability requirements not yet fully developed by regional states like CSAR. But there's growing strategic extraversion on the part of regional states, and there's little reason to see these ambitions diminishing. Turning towards more global developments, in the 2014 book we highlighted the challenge to defence planners from a fractured and complex security environment. And in 2015, this situation is even more threatening. With Western budgets unlikely to grow much, there's a premium on policymakers and defence planners considering how to provide a suitable mix and spectrum of capabilities and generating adaptive military and security capacities able to deploy rapidly and operate across all domains, as much at home in the information realm as in military theatres. In generating and measuring responses to hybrid threats, the task is doubly difficult, and there could usefully be interest in dealing with hybrid tactics before they reach red lines that might lead to military responses. This implies that states need to think hard about monitoring indicators that could provide early warning. It puts a premium on intelligence capabilities. So military forces play a vital role, but not the only one. Responses will include the deployment of conventional forces and military materiel, and investment in special operators, but they could also include cyber and information operations, strategic communications, savvy social media activities, and expertise from other government departments, as well as, where necessary, consultation or coordination with other departments, allied states or multinational organisations. These capabilities can help in developing monitoring and anticipatory intelligence capacities. Maintaining these monitoring capacities might include new ISR technologies as well as investment in combat intelligence trades. But it could also include more nuanced skills, such as those held by personnel who might be civilians, with long-term knowledge or understanding of countries, cultures, languages, perhaps distinct from human terrain analysis teams focused on current operation environments. The skills are similar, but the areas of focus will be broader. Retaining personnel with this experience or expertise might allow better understanding of the security environment in fragile regions or in potential or actual adversary states. These skills may also improve the ability to more rapidly discern signs of hybrid activity in friendly states, leading to quicker responses or improved resilience by identifying vulnerabilities. Once these areas are identified, such as vulnerable or marginalised communities susceptible to external influence or external entity dependencies, policy responses can be formulated. However, a problem for planners is that the outputs from investments in these broader capacities are difficult to measure. To retain broad awareness capacities would mean monitoring areas outside current policy priorities. Meanwhile, these capacities are not as visible as traditional military capabilities. It's paradoxical that should they prove effective in either deterring threats or in averting crises, it might be harder to demonstrate their utility, in turn making it more difficult to justify continued investment. In Western states, these capacities have been reduced into the Cold War. Rebuilding and updating them will take time and political commitment. And it might not just be in Europe or its neighbourhood where these hybrid threats may manifest themselves. Policymakers may anticipate that some current or potential state or non-state adversaries could learn from this recent application of hybrid warfare. Potential adversaries might discern what tactics worked and what capabilities are required to effect results. Other lessons might derive from perceptions of how Western governments and armed forces react and adapt. The fact remains that the potential for hybrid incidents worries states in other parts of the world. In Japan, for instance, the government has expressed unease at so-called grey zone contingencies, short of actual conflict, and possibly not involving regular forces. But for all this new form of hybrid activity isn't the only concern. Indeed, the arc of instability is widening and the in-trade of defence planners is just fuller than ever. For instance, while crises in Europe and the Middle East continue to generate headlines, so do Middle Eastern and Asian defence procurement deals. And countries in other regions are also developing and purchasing more advanced weapons. states in Latin America and Africa, both regions still facing complex security crises, are buying more sophisticated equipment. Indeed, advanced military technology is proliferating owing to rising budgets, lower technological barriers to entry, and applications of dual-use technology, as well as, of course, states' willingness to buy. But nowadays, the difference is that these include capabilities previously seen almost exclusively in Western armed forces. And with that, I'll hand over.
James, thank you very much, particularly for covering the hybrid angle. I mean, the military balance, the book is both a source of data on the 171 countries, but it's also a fairly, we like to think at least, a very serious piece of analysis, and I think that's something that we'll try to convey to you, and Giri will do that, covering the defense economics angle. Giri, please.
Thanks, Bastian. I'd like to highlight some trends in global defense economics before zooming in on the European picture. After 3 years of real reductions, global total defense spending rose in 2014 for the first time since 2010 by 1.7%. With continued defense austerity in the Western world, this increase has principally been driven by higher spending levels in emerging economies in Asia, the Middle East, and Russia. For example, the largest absolute real increases in spending in 2014 occurred in Saudi Arabia, China, and Russia, which together made up over 50% of all real global increases in 2014, and which alone more than offset declines in the rest of the world. Unsurprisingly, the composition of global reductions was dominated by North America and Europe, which accounted for 3/4 of all real spending decreases in 2014. These examples point to an underlying shift eastwards of the center of gravity of global defense outlays in recent years. US defense spending has dropped from some 47% of the global total in 2010 to around 38% in 2014, in line with the reduction in the US base and OCO budgets following the drawdown in Afghanistan and Iraq. As depicted in the latest edition of the military balance, if purchasing power parity exchange rates were used instead, the US share of global totals would be further reduced. By contrast, in the 3 years to 2014, real defense spending has grown by an average of 10% per annum in both Russia and the Middle East, although the lack of transparency in the latter region means that some of these increments have been channeled towards interior ministries as well. These findings continue trends identified in previous editions of the publication. The 2012 and 2013 editions highlighted the fact that Asian defense spending overtook NATO European outlays in 2012 for the first time in modern history. Indeed, if additional R&D spending believed to be excluded from the official Chinese defense budget are taken into account, 2015 Chinese spending probably already exceeds the combined outlays of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, the 3 largest European defense spenders. Turning to Europe, and as depicted in the bottom right-hand side graphic of the handout that was available at the entrance, defense spending continues to decline in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, on average by some 2% per annum since 2010. The steepest reductions have been in Southern Europe and the Balkans, where close to 20% reductions have been seen over a 4-year period. Significant cuts have also occurred in Western Europe, about 8% down over the same time frame, and the increases generally have been seen in Northern Europe and Southeastern Europe, where we've seen increases cumulatively of about 4% or 5% in both areas. This follows a long-run pattern of diminished European defense outlays, as depicted on the bottom left-hand graphic of the handout, which shows real spending in NATO European states over a 30-year period. Real defense spending in NATO Europe in 2013 was some 18 to 19% down from its Cold War peak in 1990, despite the European membership of the alliance growing by some 80%, from 14 to 26 states over the period. About half of this is accounted for by the 2008 financial crisis, but a significant proportion can be ascribed to states reducing the proportion of GDP allocated towards defense as a consequence of a peace or security dividend provided by the NATO umbrella. For example, of the 10 NATO accession states joining between 1999 and 2004, only Poland and Estonia have subsequently raised defense spending as a proportion of GDP, as they both undertake multi-year acquisition and modernization programs. In Bulgaria and Latvia, percentage of GDP spend increased until the 2008 crisis, before declining. But in the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Lithuania, percentage of GDP spending declined from the year of accession through the crisis and up to 2013. Of course, the original Cold War NATO European states have also reduced their percentage of GDP spend, which has halved from about 2.4% of GDP in 1990 to an average of about 1.2% in 2014. Nonetheless, there are signs of reversals of these trends, as shown in the top graphic of the handout, which features in the 2015 edition of the book. It depicts the size of the defense budget in circles, and real spending increases in blue, with real reductions in grey. As you can see, the past year has seen spending increases in Europe's northern and eastern flanks, the product of heightened threat assessments as a consequence of the Ukrainian crisis. These include Sweden, Poland, the Netherlands, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Estonia, all of which have increased funding for procurement or have accelerated existing procurement timetables across an array of land naval platforms. The Czech Republic and Romania, which have augmented funds for equipment upgrades and modernization. And while Bulgaria and Slovakia will need to recapitalize their aging Soviet-era inventories. Asset lists of these include combat aircraft, helicopters, and armored personnel carriers. And while amongst major Western European states, such as the UK and France, cash for multi-year equipment programs to 2022 and 2019 respectively have mostly already been committed, in March 2015 Germany announced that nominal defense spending would rise by some 6% over 5 years to 2019. However, there is still some way to go for NATO European states to reach the 2% of GDP NATO spending target. A thought experiment would serve to illustrate. If all European members of the alliance spent 2% of GDP on defense in 2014, regional spending would have been about $365 billion US dollars. In reality, it was $265 billion, indicating a $100 billion deficit in regional spending. The top 5 NATO European states, the UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, make up $64 billion of this gap, while the next 5, the Netherlands, Poland, Turkey, Norway, and Greece, make up a further $16 billion. The remaining 16 states, the smallest in Europe, would need to raise spending cumulatively by some 80%, collectively raising some $19 billion to meet the target. And so, in summary, while recent increments are a welcome first step, there is still some way to go before a meaningful reversal of the underlying shifts of military spending away from the West begins to occur. Thank you.
Gary, thank you very much for clarifying that global picture and then zooming in on Europe. I think it's very clear, and then the handout underlines that as well, the diversity that we're really seeing, that James also mentioned, and what it would mean in practical terms to fill that $100 billion gap. Very interesting numbers there. Ben, over to you.
There are some global strategic trends in land forces, with the United States, who of course has 2 armies, the Army and the Ground Forces and the Marine Corps, Europe and Western countries such as Australia. We see them simultaneously coping and adjusting to reflect those defence spending reductions that Jerry's described. We also see them seeking to take into their core capability many that were specially procured for Iraq and Afghanistan that are still relevant, for example, tactical UAVs, and also incorporating in their structures many of the hard lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, at the same time as they're attempting to regenerate their capability for contingency and expeditionary operations. We also see a trend in the Middle East and Asia Pacific, and to a certain extent Latin America, where rising economies are investing a proportion of their economic growth in the modernisation of their land forces. And above all this is China and Russia, who are not only attempting to digitise and comprehensively modernise their armies, but they're also reorganising on a recognisable brigade structure. The 2 major land wars of this year, of course, have some interesting points about them. The rise of ISIS. Now, it has certainly energised intelligence agencies and police forces in handling the domestic terrorist threat from returned jihadists or self-radicalising lone wolves. And there are some interesting lessons, for example, from the way the Belgian and French authorities handled the terrorist attacks in those countries. But ISIS has proved a very interesting military hybrid threat. It's part an insurgency, and it's still active along with other Sunni insurgents behind the lines, behind the berms in Sunni areas of Iraq. It's part terrorist group, but it's also part highly mobile light infantry. And we saw this illustrated last year. First of all, classic urban and rural insurgency, weakened and demoralised Iraqi government forces in and around Mosul. Once Mosul fell, ISIS demonstrated an ability to do manoeuvre warfare. It had flying columns in technicals and captured vehicles, and showed an impressive ability to find the gaps in the Iraqi government positions and manoeuvre around them to cut them off. Government positions were then subjected to indirect fire, sometimes for a couple of days. Then there was a close assault where checkpoint defences and berms were breached by suicide bombers, and the position was then subject to an infantry close assault, sometimes led by waves of relatively expendable foreign fighters. But there's no doubt that ISIS ground forces have a hard core of pretty capable infantry. And when they do their assault, they include cameramen filming the destruction, carnage, and any subsequent executions to be exploited by ISIS's modern and effective propaganda operation. And I believe it's shown itself to be adaptable, possibly the most adaptable insurgency so far this century. Clearly, its advance was stopped last fall, in part because of the US-led airstrikes, but just as important was the mass mobilisation of pro-government Iraqi militias, largely Shia, and many advised and assisted by Iran. And it's my assessment that what we see inside Iraq is a competition for influence between Iran and its allies in Iraqi politics, and the US and its allies as they build the capability of the Iraqi army. Now, this approach was tested recently by the efforts to recapture Tikrit from ISIS. Initially, it seems to me that they were led by the Shia militia, advised by Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. And the Iraqi armies certainly initially seemed to be playing a subordinate role, but when the offensive got stuck at the centre of Tikrit, the army, with US airstrikes leveraged, went into the lead. ISIS quite clearly, although it's largely been contained, still retains an ability for serious tactical counterattacks, as we've seen over the weekend in Ramadi. Now, the centre of gravity of the land campaign will be regaining control of Mosul, Iraq's second city, and in a sense that will be a test of the two competing approaches. But the centre of gravity of the campaign as a whole is whether the Baghdad government can regain the trust of Iraq's Sunni minority, or at least create the conditions that they no longer support ISIS. And the behaviour of many of the Shia militias, many of whom are Iranian supported since last summer, with credible reports of multiple human rights violations and sectarian cleansing, will have done nothing to help this. And it's not clear to me that either the Iraqi government or the coalition is adequately countering ISIS's information operations yet. As James said, the other hybrid conflict has been Ukraine. Now, the sophisticated operation to take over the Ukraine, led by Spetsnaz and elite Russian forces, was interesting in a number of respects, not least that both sides made a large effort to avoid the use of lethal force, in which they were largely successful. Russia may have been aided by its various intelligence agencies penetrating the Ukrainian state. But there's a key question in the fighting since. Why, at every decisive point, have the separatist forces been able to overwhelm the Ukrainian government forces? Well, bearing in mind that they were both the same forces in the early 90s, the first problem is Ukraine underinvested in defence consistently. Secondly, its military capability was eroded by corruption. But when it comes to the fighting, the initial government offensive, which had some success, was stopped in its tracks by concentrated professional artillery fire coming from Russian artillery units just across the border. And since then, what's left of the Ukrainian Air Force has been neutralised by layered air defence over the separatist territory. And the Ukrainian government forces have lost information superiority, particularly with successful use in support of the separatists of drones and signals intelligence, triggering mortar, artillery and rocket attacks or heavy jamming. And what we've seen is classic combined arms fighting with artillery, infantry and tanks combining together in combined arms attacks that have overwhelmed defending government troops. Evidence that heavy metal's back, and it's back with a vengeance. Now, civilian suffering in Ukraine has been profound, and the use of militias and volunteer battalions are going to complicate any eventual peace settlement. Now, it's a very complicated political situation in Ukraine with different currents flowing in different directions. And into this has been introduced the question of arms to Ukraine. And there are some on the Hill who feel very vocally that it's the United States' duty to support the Ukrainian people in their hour of greatest need. But our assessment is that because of geography, any substantive flow of modern equipment, modern offensive equipment to the Ukrainian government forces could be overmatched and more quickly by the Russians. And now over to Douglas to talk about Russian military modernisation.
Thanks, Ben. I'll briefly touch on two areas in the book that I think are worthy of note. One being the essay on directed energy, and the other being in some aspects of Russian military modernisation. Obviously, given my particular interests, it will be Air Force Heavy and Land and Naval Light.
Could you speak up, please?
Could
you speak up, please?
Yeah, sure. Is that any better? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Do we need a translator from Scotland? Directed energy. Directed energy has been on the cusp of entering service since I would, or what you would describe as sixth grade as far as I was concerned, which is now quite some considerable time ago. When I was doing some research in this area, I looked up some 1970s volumes of my old alma mater, which was Aviation Week and Space Technology. The early 1970s, Av Week had some very, very good and initially very positive articles on laser weaponry. It was effectively just around the corner, there was significant expenditure, and the weapons were going to come to fruition quite quickly. What in fact transpired obviously was that that didn't happen. The articles got more sceptical in tone and have pretty much remained that way for several decades. So what's changed? Why, in our assessment, do we now think that both laser and radio frequency weapons are now much closer to service entry in a broader application range than we've seen any time previously? If you would ask me what the single biggest factor was or is, I'd simply say it's the lowering of ambition. You know, we're no longer trying to shoot down a ballistic missile at very long range. We're trying to shoot down a small target, a UAV, at very close range. Your parameters suddenly go from being not in your favour in terms of range and power requirements to being much more immediately addressable, both in terms of range, the power requirement, and things like pointing and steering. It's just much easier. That's not to say that the long-term and medium-term ambition is gone. It's just that I think we're probably aiming for now the low-hanging fruit, which is much more achievable. You're talking about power ranges in kilowatts rather than megawatts, tens of kilowatts. The USS Ponce last year, very positive outcomes by all accounts. So I think we'll see that the short range air defence, both in terms of ship defence and land-based air defence, will be an application that comes to fruition in the US and elsewhere more quickly than others. As with laser systems, our assessment is that radio frequency weapons are also likely to see wider acceptance into countries' arsenals in the near to medium term now. Now, given the nature and capabilities of such systems, the classification of much of the work actually makes it more difficult, I think, to draw a fully accurate picture of the work that's ongoing in several nations. Obviously in the US you've seen things like CHAMP. In the UK the work has been underway for the past 2 decades, various projects. We've seen names like Virus and JD, although and neither has the UK MOD actually ever confirmed those projects or talked about them. We do know they have been underway. And at one point there was ambitions to field test a payload that would be deliverable by a cruise missile in around 2010. Whether that has actually ever happened or not, again, the UK MOD is not confirmed. Now, one of the other countries that has had a long-standing interest in DE is Russia. Again, both laser and radio frequency. And I'm sure that under its current state armament programme, that level of work is continuing. Perhaps some of it's coming back on stream. The military in Russia is now in the midst of bedding down and in some instances actually advising a structural reform and re-equipment programme that was launched by then Defence Minister Anatoly Sergikov in late 2008. The aim being that by 2020 the Russian military would be a modern, well-equipped force capable of engaging in high-intensity warfare. At the same time, the country's nuclear inventory has been revamped, and again in the 2020 to 2025 period, most of the systems should be new. The 2015 military balance, I think, helps reveal the extent and the limits of the progress of the re-equipment and restructuring projects, the latter of which continue to be tinkered with at the very least. In the air domain, the Air Force continues to take delivery of the Su-35S multi-role fighter, the Su-34 full-back strike aircraft, along with the Su-30SM and the Su-30M2. The first squadron of the Su-35S, which is based at Zemgy, we expect to see them declare initial operational capability this year. Our second squadron is being formed at that base as well. The Air Force is also continuing to receive an upgraded variant of the MiG-31 Foxhound, the MiG-31BM. In the strategic arena, the Air Force is at long last actually begun to take upgrades of both the Tu-160 Blackjack and the Tu-95 MS Bear, and there is also an upgrade programme for the Tu-22M Backfire. Again, these things basically you can trace back to the late 1980s, but throughout the 1990s the lack of money put these programmes on hold. They are now being wheeled out, although the numbers are small. In terms of the rotary environment, combat helicopters, Mi-28 and Havoc and the Ka-52, you've seen significant deliveries, and the production rates of those look like they're set to continue. However, in terms of what the Russians call the state armament programme, that's the Russian acronym is GPV, the 2011 to 2020 programme and the follow-on programme, which goes from 2016 to 2025, there are clear negative trends emerging, at least from a Russian perspective. Elements of the 2011 to 2020 programme have not been met. The Air Force was due to take 52 of the aircraft being developed to meet the service's PAC-FAR requirement for a fifth generation fighter. Deliveries of series production aircraft are due to begin next year. In late March, however, the Defence Ministry announced that only 12 of the aircraft, that is the Sukhoi T-50 is the industrial designation for it, would actually be procured up until 2020. The more challenging economic environment was given as the reason for the delay. However, I suspect that this probably covered technical issues as well. The programme is running at least 3 years late, and they continue to struggle in some aspects of this. And while there is widespread anticipation that the Air Force will acquire 96 Su-35Ss, that's probably the last development of the flanker will see, at least as a single-seat platform. So far, only 48 have been ordered. That order should be concluded by the end of this year. As of yet, we've yet to see the follow-on order for another 48. Intended to complement the air platforms are a variety of new or upgraded air-to-air and air-to-surface weapons. These include basically Russia's first medium-range active beyond visual range missile, and supposedly equivalent to the AMRAAM AIM-120CD in terms of capability. The AX-12B Adder, they claim it's in production. We haven't seen any on a frontline aircraft yet. Similarly, there's a long-range weapon associated with the MiG-31BM upgrade, which is the R-37M A-13 axe head. Again, we've seen test rounds. There were some pictures recently of Medvedev being shown test rounds in the factory. No images yet of the missile axe aircraft. In terms of tactical air-to-surface weaponry, the most important one is the Ka-38. Similarly, we've seen images of some of that family on the Su-34 at a test range. Again, don't know if we've actually seen it on a frontline aircraft. Finally, I just touched briefly on the strategic realm in terms of cruise missiles, the Ka-101-102 family, in development since the late 1980s. Very important programme for them, for the Air Force that keeps them in strategic business. It's the replacement for the Ka-55, the ES-15 Kent. There is a bit of good news from a Russian perspective in this, in that missile now seems to be getting through the front line. Images of a frontline service Tu-95 from Engels were seen recently with the pylons associated with that missile actually on the aircraft. So at an operational base rather than a test base. By way of closure, I'd simply say that the slippage we've seen in the 2011-2020 state armament programme looks like it will continue in the 2016-2025. They are trying to sustain the defence budget, but given their economic problems, it's going to be very interesting to watch how that all plays out. Thank you.
Doug, thank you very much, and to all of you. We've tried to give you a flavour of economics, conflict, technology, equipment, the themes that a lot of the analysis in the book deals with. We now have a good 20-25 minutes for a Q&A session and maybe some discussion. If you'd like to ask questions, make comments, please do let me know, and I will call on you. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Please. Do we have a microphone? Yes, it's coming. 1 second. Third row. If you could identify yourself.
Good afternoon, Otto Kreischer with Sea Power magazine. The Soviets showed the Russians, showing my age, the Russians showed fairly competent special forces guys in the takeover of Ukraine, or Crimea. What's your assessment of the overall Russian army? They're still using large numbers of conscripts, and some of them that have been captured or shown up don't appear to be all that good. But we know they have some good elite troops. What's the overall status of their land forces?
Thank you very much. That was we'll collect 2 or 3, and then we'll go back. Fourth row. Yeah.
Mike Massetic, PBS.
That's it.
Is it better?
We can hear you.
Mike Massetic, PBS Online NewsHour. In your assessment of the Chinese military buildup, do you get into their ambitions? Is it the first line, the second line, Hawaii, regional hegemony? Where are they going? And also, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the RAND report of a couple of 3 months ago, in which they pointed out there's still some significant gaps which are going to take at least another 10 years to fill out?
Thank you. And let's take the third one here in the first row, in the middle. We'll come back for a second round.
Thank you. Inigo Guevara. I'm here as an independent consultant. When we look at Russia's increased activity in the polar circle, and we add its increased activity also in Nicaragua and additional port visits to Cuba, talk about restarting the Loreto listening station, etc. I'd like to get the panel's perspective on whether we're looking at sort of an encirclement strategy to try to bring about threats directly to North America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ben, do you want to start on the Russian army assessment?
Yeah, we've been doing detailed assessments on Russian military capability and its modernization program since 2008. The Crimea operation, the main role was played by Spetsnaz and elite airborne and naval infantry, so it wasn't a test of the whole system, and there wasn't much fighting. What are the Russian strengths? The first strength is artillery. They've actually got much more of it than NATO. The average Russian brigade has 3 times as much mortars, tube artillery and rocket artillery than a NATO brigade. And we've had a powerful reminder of just how effective artillery is in both Iraq and Ukraine. They've also got this very strong layered air defence. They've also got a lot of armour, and they can also move it at operational and strategic distances by rail very quickly to concentrate force around their borders. And they've managed to do it over the last year without disrupting the civilian rail network at all. The negative point is the quality of their conscripts is probably highly variable. They don't have NCOs and warrant officers in the way that the US and Western armed forces do. And there's also been a great effort to overcome corruption and inefficiency, which is still a problem. But you're not comparing like, you've got to be careful not to compare like with like when you're, say, comparing them with, Russian brigade with US Army brigade. The greatest advantage that the US and its allies has, though, is the quality, particularly in land forces and air forces, based on the battle hardening of the whole force over a generation of fighting, and sufficient time to promote people who've proven in combat. With regard to the Rand report on China, which took the unusual point of view of looking at Chinese weaknesses as its line of departure, to me that was quite persuasive. I'm not the Institute's expert on China, but one of the things that came out there was the lack of operational experience in all three Chinese armed forces.
Ben, thank you. Doug? Or James first? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just to say a little bit about the conscripts. Very interesting question, actually. It's the position of conscripts in the wider armed force is not just an issue for Russia, it's an issue for China, it's an issue for Lithuania, said it's going to restart conscription now. How do you balance regular armed forces with conscripts? In Russia, one of the biggest problems, I think, come from the fact that they reduced the term of service to a year. So what level of training do your conscripts actually have? So integrating them, therefore, into a wider force structure in the way that you create military effect is a problem. And just looking at what we say in the book here, special forces units, for example, could not be deployed in full to Crimea in 2014, some of them, as they included a contingent of conscripts only drafted the previous autumn. So, yeah, the rapid reaction capacities that have been the subject of a lot of the emphasis under the military reform process were used. But still, it's not a complete capability in that sense, because they're managing two different streams of personnel. And I think, as I said, that's not just a problem that Russia will face; it's a problem that China will face, and other conscript nations too.
On the question of China, I mean, I suppose one person's build-up is another person's modernization. What are the Chinese actually up to? You've got to keep in mind that this is a force structure that, if you go back to the 1980s, was full on the Air Force side, at least, of 1950s Soviet era design stuff that would have been fabulous target practice and not used for much else. So they're modernising, certainly. They're not modernising on a one-for-one basis. They're swapping out substantial numbers for much smaller numbers. That obviously has implications. As for what the intent is, once they fully modernise the capability, then that's obviously the as many million-dollar question as you want to pose. I think there are greater minds, certainly than mine, that will spend a long time pondering exactly what Beijing wants to do with this, how far it wants to push, if indeed it wants to push at all, if in fact it just sees it as it's a purely defensive capability. Enigo, on your question on what the Russians are up to, same kind of statement really, in the sense that one of the things I got interested in is obviously that when the Bears in particular started to come back out to play after almost 20 years of not doing very much at all. In the UK, from about 2008, 2009, there have been in the order of 8 intercepts a year. To give you some sense of what that was like back in the good old bad old days and the Cold War, it was running in the order of about 1 a day. So the activity level is way down. It's not absolutely the same across the board. Obviously around the Baltics it's much higher. And in fact the figures released by the Japanese in the past couple of days again flag up that there is increased Russian activity. It's with quite old kit. The one thing I would say in terms of that, of course, is that it's all about political signalling. Flying your aircraft really close to somebody else's military airspaces, or airspace in general, is it is a signal. It's not what you would do operationally, given that the new cruise missile is a range somewhere in the order of 5,000 kilometres. That puts you a long way away from somebody else's airspace and still able to be quite a threat.
Giri, do you want to add a bit of texture to Chinese spending, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. Like Doug, I can't pretend to know what they intend to do, but perhaps I can speculate on how much money they will have in order to do it. Generally speaking, Chinese defense spending has gone up at the same rate as GDP growth, although the lack of transparency in the numbers provided does give you pause to wonder what is going into those headline numbers and what lies beneath them. But in general, it has been increasing on average by about 10% per year. That is slowed to about 7%, certainly this year and in 2013. There was a spike in 2014 of about 8%. But I think the relative balance of spending in that part of the world matters too, not just the absolute Chinese increases. So if you look at the numbers in 2014, right, if you just took the increases in Asia, right, all the states that increased spending, if you tabulate that all up, how much of that was accounted for by China? And the answer is 2/3, right? 2/3 of the entire Asian increase going to China. So that's really significant. The other thing to, talking about horizons and where they might want to go in the future, at the moment, Chinese spending is in 2010, it was about 28% of the Asian total by our estimates, right? If you simply take the IMF growth forecast going out to 2019, right, and you still take the same proportion of GDP, they will account for something like 41 to 42% of the Asian total. Now you compare that with Japan, which in 2010 was about 20% of the Asian total, and you do the same exercise and they go to 10% of the Asian total. So you're starting to see in the next 5 years really quite significant differentials in the level of resources that states in that part of the world are going to be able to bring to bear to modernize their capabilities. So I'll leave it with that question.
Giri, thank you very much. I saw there were a couple of other questions. Can we get the microphone back to the front here, second row? The gentleman on my left, and then
Thank you.
If you just could then afterwards pass the mic down the line.
David Lynch with Bloomberg. For Mr. Hackett, could you elaborate a little bit on your comment about the proliferation of advanced technologies and talk perhaps about a couple of specific areas where the U.S. in particular may have lost some of its technological edge, if in fact that's what's happened?
Thank you. If you could just pass the mic over there. Thank you.
Yes, Marisa Lino with Northrop Grumman. I want to take a different aspect of the question asked by the gentleman in the front row, where he was asking about Russia pushing into the Arctic, its activities in Ukraine, Crimea, its flights near borders, etc., and ask what is the impact on Russian defense spending? How long can they afford to keep an uptick? Obviously, they can make other parts of their budget suffer for defense purposes when you don't have to worry about a Congress. Thank you.
Are there further questions for this round? Yes, sir. Here in the first row.
Paul Sullivan at the National Defense University and Georgetown. I'm not sure what's starting that.
Maybe just can you turn off the mic there? Yeah, we can hear you.
Paul Sullivan at National Defense University in Georgetown. Could we focus a bit on Iran for a moment? We can take a snapshot of their military spending, their weapons, and all of that, but what can you judge from proxy variables and other understanding of the country what their intent might be?
Are there further questions? Yes.
Charles Faulkner with the PGR Group. Based on what you've seen in Ukraine and what has happened in Africa, what do you see over the horizon for French ground forces and French expeditionary forces?
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions at this stage, I'll close the list. Gives us 5-6 minutes to respond before we run out of time, and I know you all have other things to do. Questions were on Iran, and the trends that we see there, equipment side, but also intent in particular. Then you might want to say a few words about the Iranian way of building capacity elsewhere, maybe, because that's might say something about intent. We have a question about French. You said ground forces. Ben, why don't you start us off on those, and then we'll get to the others.
The impression I get is France is very serious about being back in NATO, including being a partner to the US, and it's serious about modernisation, even against a declining defence budget and an economy that's still struggling as part of the Eurozone. Particular points of interest is they have an ambitious programme of digitisation of a new modern range of wheeled armoured vehicles, which the reconnaissance vehicle is extremely interesting and would sit very well, for example, in a striker brigade combat team. They're also notably the first army to really field a digitised soldier system, Phalan, and they're in the lead on that. I don't think any other major army has fielded anything like that. And they're also deadly serious about UK-France cooperation as part of a bilateral thing. Iran. It seems to me that their strategic aim over the last decade has firstly been to avoid regime change by the US and its allies. They've succeeded in that. Secondly, they've increased their influence in Iraq, and they're sustaining their influence in Syria. And Quds Force, in many respects, is an interagency agent. It combines the capabilities of paramilitary intelligence agency, classic special operations forces, and quite clearly that Soleimani, the leader, basically controlled Iranian diplomacy with respect to Iraq and the Levant. And it seems to me that's probably still their long-term aim. I take that not so much from their statements, but from their actions. I finally add one question for Bloomberg. My question to you is, many of the advantages the potential opponents of the US have are not advanced technology advantages, they're low technology advantages. Landmines, IEDs, which is a subset of landmines, sea mines, indirect fire, lots of it, mortars and rockets. And these low-tech systems can, of course, have a bit of high-tech added, be it GPS guidance, be it sophisticated fusing system. But the last decade has shown that the way US and Western forces were structured, they really challenged to adapt to that. And I'd say that's the other part of the equation that a fixation on high-tech potential enemy capability could mistakenly cloud judgment on.
That said, I'd still be interested in this practice.
We will turn to James now, actually, to add some thoughts on that particular question. But James, if you want to say a few words on France and Africa, obviously.
Thanks, Bastian. We've covered the Africa stuff each year in the military balance, and there's a lot of it. It could be a whole book in itself. People tend to think of Africa as one, as the security challenges are similar across the continent. They are very. France has, as has ramped up its involvement with Operation Barkhane and linking Sahel operations. They still tend to be focused on Francophone states. I think. What are the implications of this? Well, they're going to continue because the threat hasn't gone away. And with the effective sort of collapse of borders as well as security structures and states in some parts, some of the Sahelian parts of Africa, that requires not just military involvement, but it requires long-standing whole-of-government involvement, and not just by the French. In terms of the military implications, increased operational costs. The French have been trimming budgets for the last couple of years now, and what was announced in January wasn't a new increase, it was just a reduction in the decrease in terms of personnel count. What are the equipment implications of it? ISR, persistent ISR. They brought Reaper in to replace or to add to Harfang, because that's what you need in that part of Africa. Monitoring of convoy movements, insurgent convoy movements, weapons movements. But the question then is, how do you then link that into local state military capacities? Because the long term, that's what you need to build up. I think the international community and France, in terms of developing regional armed forces to do the job long term, will be thinking of that as a bit of a challenge. On advanced technologies. The book this year has an essay on space systems, and we talk about there are more spacefaring nations than ever before. The cost to enter space growing less. Space is becoming more congested. So what does that mean for the states that use space in military terms? It means you've got to consider that there are threats from crowded environment in terms of the sheer amount of debris, satellites that are up there, but also the potential vulnerabilities from other states' military use of space. So, the piece in the book traces, interestingly, what the US is doing about this in terms of how to restructure satellite architectures. So you have multiple mini satellites rather than reliance on one biggie that, if it is hit, will pull down part of a network or something like that. What's another part of this? Commercial off-the-shelf technologies, growth in stuff that you can just buy. Handheld GPS, secure communications, all these things that actually enable military operations that you can just get pretty easily, a lot more easily than a few years ago. UCAVs, unmanned systems rather, just saying, or RPAS, as Douglas would have me say, that's very correct on aviation terms. There was the released imagery of what could be a possible Chinese airframe recently, in terms of a UCAV, potentially. Nigeria has been employing UAVs. And we're not talking, and those are fairly big systems. When you look at some of the stuff that's been used in eastern Ukraine, they're just quadcopters. And some of those are crowdsourced. They're not actually within state military structures. That's another problem to the Ukraine dimension, is managing the non-state military formations that are using military technologies. But there is a proliferation of this stuff in the high tech as well, as Ben said, the low tech. I think Doug will add a little bit more on technical.
Just on the advanced technology and the erosion of Western advantage, if you like. One of the areas we've seen, and it's not new, but it's continuing in interesting ways, is cruise missile proliferation. High-speed anti-ship cruise missiles, Soviet area of interest, continues into the Russian period, goes to the Chinese. Last year's Zhuhai Air Show, the Chinese turned up with a missile called CSS-X-1, which is a large ramjet anti-ship missile which looked a lot like an Indian system co-developed. The Russians called BrahMos, which itself is actually just a Russian system, really. Zhuhai, anything showed at the air show is at least ostensibly available for export. So this is a large Chinese anti-ship missile, very capable, high speed, a real problem if you're setting a ship. Probably not completed development. The reason that it's out there is because the Chinese are probably looking for somebody to co-fund finishing off the program, because it's probably the loser in an internal Chinese program. One of the things they seem to do is, if you have a project, you run two, that's your industry. Somebody wins, obviously, somebody loses, and the loser suddenly thinks, I'm going to put this stuff out in the marketplace and see if anybody buys it. As the Chinese close the technology gap with the West, they will become much more credible as a provider, not obviously to countries who either in the West or traditionally have bought from the US, but countries which have perhaps previously bought from the Russians, or a more independent procurement approach. And the Chinese will turn up with some pretty capable kit for countries that previously haven't been perhaps noted for having top-end or decent systems. To give one example, the Chinese are in the process of probably finishing off development and putting into production a new dogfight short-range air-to-air missile. PL-10 is what we think it's called. The current Chinese offerings in that area are pretty old hat by now. They've been out there for a long time. We pretty much know what they do. PL-10, when it comes onto the export market, as I expect it will, if it's not quite a game changer, it certainly is going to make you pay attention to what the other side has, because it could go to a number of countries who might unfortunately bump up against in a way that we wouldn't necessarily like to.
Douglas, thank you very much. In the end, most of it is about money, so we will close on this. A lady from Northrop who asked a question about the Russian defense budget had to leave, but nonetheless, Gary, how robust is the Russian defense spending?
Okay, well, talking about the money, I think it helps to start with what the ambition was in the first place before the whole sanctions and oil price poll came into play. The Russians intended to spend 3.15% of GDP on defense in 2013, rising to 3.5% in 2014 and 4.2% this year. That equates to a year-on-year increase this year of 25% in real terms. This is a huge increase, 1% of GDP over 3 years. Right? It's a huge increase they intended to go on, subsequently tailing off. I think a third of the state armament program to 2020 was envisaged to be spent in the first 5 years. So we're starting with a very ambitious baseline. And in the intervening period, we've had sanctions as well as the oil price decline, which in December precipitates a currency crisis, which threatens to produce a banking crisis in that country. I think they stabilize the situation through a combination of debt equity swaps, but also using funds from the national wealth funds, as well as recapitalizing some of the banks using funding from the general state budget. It's not entirely clear what the mix of those three elements has been, but it seems that that's what they've done. Nonetheless, this has produced what is expected to be a 4 to 5% contraction in GDP this year. Now, bearing in mind they were expecting to spend 4.2% of GDP on defense, and GDP is contracting, right? That means your percent of GDP spent on defense is going to be even higher. So I think these are some significant challenges. Having said that, there is great political will to maintain spending, and I think so far budget cuts of about 10% across many departments have exempted defense, but I think also pensions as well as agriculture. And I see our colleague Sam Sharp is in the audience, and so he may want to say a few words on the economic picture after I do. But just to finish up, I think the key thing is going to be in the next 2 quarters, right? To what extent has the lending contraction to business resulted in business failures? In December, you had capital flight, but also deposit flight, and a real contraction of lending to business. So that's really significant. And also the second thing is the extent that non-performing loans are going to hit the banking sector in the next two quarters. I think that will determine the extent to which the state will have to bolster the state banks, and by consequence determine what deficit they're running and how much they have to allocate towards defense. So we'll see.
Giri, thank you very much. Sam, since Giri has volunteered you, I think Sam Sharp, our Russia and Eurasia specialist, is sitting there. I'm sure he'll be around for a couple of minutes afterwards if somebody would like to take up Giri's offer of interviewing Sam. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this launch of the Military Balance 2015. Thank you for challenging and very, very interesting questions that gave us an opportunity to engage with the material in the book. I hope you all get a lot of views out of the book. We are, of course, already working on next year's edition. It's one of the joys of these annual publication. But thank you very much for coming to the IISS-US for this launch. Hope to see you again soon. How are you?